Please support this channel by clicking on the links below. Race and Culture, A Worldview by Thomas Sowell. Men are not blank tablets on which the environment inscribes a culture which can readily be erased to make way for a new inscription. Oscar Handlin. Preface. This book challenges many dogmas of so-called social science, as well as many underlying assumptions about racial issues and cultural differences. This challenge is based on more than a decade of research for this book, which in turn represents the culmination of more than 20 years of research and writing on issues of race and ethnicity in general. Race and culture covers a wider range of subjects and issues than any of my previous writings in this area. It draws upon research, discussions, and observations in many countries visited during journeys that took me completely around the world twice, and other journeys that took me twice around the Pacific Basin. These travels were not incidental. In addition to a large amount of literature collected and many discussions with scholars, officials, and others in various countries, these on-site observations made vivid what words or photographs could only begin to suggest. There is nothing like being inside the great mosque in Cordoba, seeing its grand design and the fine craftsmanship with which it was constructed 1,000 years ago, to appreciate the achievements of the civilization from which it came, and to see, a short walk away, a bridge built another 1,000 years before that by the Romans, still carrying heavy traffic today, is to see another great civilization's cultural impact when Spain was part of the Roman Empire. To walk through a graveyard in an old village in Australia's Barossa Valley and see all the gravestones written in German in this English-speaking country is to get a sense of the tenacity of the German culture, even when transplanted 10,000 miles from home, from the ancient walled city of Jerusalem to the ultra-modern city-state of Singapore. Each place told its own story in its own way. Perhaps the best way to focus on the central theme of this book is by contrast with prevailing quote-unquote social science doctrines, which make the surrounding environment the shaper of groups' behavior and institutional decisions the arbiters of their fate. While we can all agree on the influence of environment in some very general sense, there is a vast difference between one, regarding groups as being shaped by immediate circumstances, including the people and institutions around them, and two, regarding groups as having their own internal cultural patterns, antedating the environment in which they currently find themselves, and transcending the beliefs, biases, and decisions of others. The vast migrations of peoples over the centuries have left many racial and cultural groups in settings radically different from the settings in which their own cultures evolved, facing challenges and opportunities undreamed of by their ancestors. Group cultural patterns may indeed be products of environments, but often of environments that existed on the other side of an ocean, in the lives of ancestors long forgotten, yet transmitted over the generations as distilled values, preferences, skills, and habits. The outward veneer of a new society, its language, dress, and customs, may mask these underlying differences in cultural values, which are nevertheless revealed when the hard choices of life have to be made and sacrifices endured to achieve competing goals. Where an analysis is confined to one society, racial and ethnic groups in the United States, for example, it can be difficult to establish which patterns are the result of the way particular groups were treated in American society and which are the results of their own internal cultural patterns. But where the analysis is international in scope, then the group patterns which recur in country after country can more readily be distinguished from historical differences in the group's experience from one country to another. The fundamental conflict between the approach which focuses on group cultural patterns and that which attributes intergroup economic and social differences to differential treatment by society leads to other differences. These derivative differences include very different weights attached to political activity as a factor in group advancement. For example, if a poorer group's fate is largely in the hands of contemporary outsiders, then political activity designed to persuade or pressure those outsiders is essential to the group's progress. But if a group's own culture and the skills, behavior, and performances derived from that culture are the primary determinants of its economic and social fate, then groups which rise from poverty to prosperity need not be particularly active politically, nor particularly successful in whatever political activity they engage in. History indeed records numerous groups rising from poverty to prosperity in many parts of the world with no corresponding political activity or political success. Chinese, German, Japanese, Italian, and Indian immigrants have risen to prosperity in many countries, often after harrowing beginnings, without ever achieving any notable political success. Such political leaders as have occasionally risen from such groups have typically come to prominence only after the group was already well established economically, and have typically represented broader constituencies in the larger society, rather than being spokesmen for their own ethnic interest. By contrast, the Irish have been unusually successful politically at many levels, including becoming prime ministers of Britain, Canada, and Australia, and presidents of the United States. Yet, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to argue from history that the Irish have risen more rapidly than these other groups. With all groups, important changes take place over time, so that neither their own cultures nor those of the surrounding societies in which they live remain absolutely fixed. Economic and technological progress alone require and ensure this. Nevertheless, existing cultural values have much to do with which groups keep up with the advances of science, technology, and organization, which fall behind, and which spearhead the advancing frontiers of human knowledge. But while time is often an important variable in changing relationships among groups, nations, or civilizations, time by itself accomplishes nothing. In particular, it is a serious mistake with dangerous consequences to imagine that time itself improves relations among racial and ethnic groups. History shows dramatic, tragic, and sustained retrogressions, as well as periods of progress in the relations among groups. For example, there was not a single race riot between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka during the first half of the 20th century. But mob violence and ghastly atrocities between these two groups have become commonplace in the last half of the century. In the United States, blacks living in various northern cities in the last quarter of the 19th century experienced growing acceptance, exemplified by an absence of black ghettos. But such ghettos took shape, among other signs of growing hostility to blacks in the early 20th century. In Europe, Jews experienced less discrimination and violence during the first 1,000 years of the Christian era than in the second 1,000 years. Culture, as the term is used here, will not be confined to what one scholar on ethnicity has called, quote-unquote, real culture, such as music and art. On the contrary, the focus here will be primarily on those aspects of culture which provide the material requirements for life itself, the specific skills, general work habits, and saving propensities, and attitudes towards education and entrepreneurship. In short, what economists call, quote, human capital. That is not because of a glorification of the practical, conceived of as an antithesis to higher culture, but because the material resources from which physical survival itself must come are also requirements for music, art, literature, philosophy, and other forms of higher culture. In general, it is precisely the more prosperous societies and the more prosperous groups within given societies which have a sufficient margin of time and resources to devote to higher culture, rather than to meeting survival needs. Moreover, in comparing groups and societies, matters of subjective taste and habitual conditioning are so intimately involved in evaluations of music and art that it is far more problematical to speak of one group or society as being more advanced or more effective in these realms than to say that one group or society is more advanced in industrial skills or medical care. While the histories of many groups are fascinating in themselves, the ultimate purpose of this study is not description but analysis. It attempts to show some of the ways in which their cultures or human capital have affected the advancement of particular groups, the societies of which they were part, and ultimately the human race. Human capital has not been randomly distributed, being itself a product of circumstances that have varied widely in different parts of the world with different climates, geography, and histories. The purpose of this book is not to offer some grand theory explaining cultural differences. Its goal is to demonstrate the reality, persistence, and consequences of cultural differences, contrary to many of today's grand theories based on the supposedly dominant role of quote-unquote objective conditions, economic forces, or social structures. This book deliberately offers little in the way of direct policy prescription, for its underlying premise is that what is most needed is an understanding of existing realities, the history from which the present evolved, and the enduring principles constraining our options for the future. There is seldom a shortage of people willing to draw up blueprints for salvation. What is important is that such people and those who judge their proposals both understand what they are talking about. Lest the word race in the title of this book lead to misunderstanding or to quibbling, the term is used in the same general sense in which it has been used in my earlier writings, dating back to race and economics. The term race will be used here in the broad social sense in which it is applied in everyday life to designate ethnic groups of various sorts by race, religion, or nationality. A more scientific definition of race is not attempted, for such a definition would have little relevance to the human beings currently inhabiting this planet after untold centuries of racial intermixtures. In much the same way, continent is not always a strictly geographical term. Yet, few people object because Europe and Asia are considered separate continents, despite being one continuous landmass. The real distinction between them is not geographical, but biological, that racially different people originated on different sides of the Caucasus Mountains. Because this study focuses more on social realities rather than on biological realities, it defines racial or ethnic groups primarily in social rather than biological terms. Thus, Adolf Plessy, of Plessy v. Ferguson fame, is defined here as black, even though he was 7/8 Caucasian, and people with less Caucasian ancestry than that are considered white, or branco, in Brazil. This is also in keeping with the cultural focus of this study, for Plessy was raised in the black culture of the United States, and Brancos with more African ancestry than Plessy were raised in the Branco culture of Brazil. Similarly, we need not address the philosophical and legal question that is controversial in Israel. Who is a Jew? For our purposes, a Jew is anyone who is socially regarded as a Jew, whatever the religious or biological realities may be. Only in Chapter 6, Race and Intelligence, will the focus shift to a more biological conception of race, when discussing issues of heredity and environment. Race is one of the ways of collectivizing people in our minds. In some societies, it is the most important way of separating people for differential treatment. In other societies, however, people are treated differently according to their religion, nationality, caste, or other characteristics. Each characteristic has its own mystique, and there is no reason to assume that the mystique of race is unique in its pervasiveness or its power, except in particular societies. In other societies, people may face oppression, humiliation, or even genocide, while being physically indistinguishable from the surrounding population. In many cases, special modes of dress, insignia, or other indicators of a group membership have been imposed, precisely because there are no natural biological indicators to provide practical guidance in carrying out policies of differential treatment. Race is a biological concept, but it is a social reality. How important it is in a given setting can only be determined empirically from an examination of that setting. To all the usual difficulties of trying to understand any complex subject, there is an added dimension of difficulty in trying to analyze racial and cultural issues. Emotions are often high and sensitivities great on all sides. Conclusions that disturb comfortable or convenient visions, or the reputations or careers based on them, are certain to attract not only criticisms, but denunciations, distortions, and even outright lies. No matter how many times in history myriads of individuals or groups have each claimed to have the one and only truth and have subsequently been proven wrong, there are still new claimants who feel that any challenge to their particular view is not only intellectually invalid, but also a moral outrage to be discredited and stamped out at all costs. However, the progress of the human race would not have been possible, and we would all still be living in caves if there were not also other people willing to weigh new ideas and evidence, to take what they can from them, and to gain what insights they can, even from reasoning with which they cannot fully agree. It is for such people that this book is written. End of preface.